Okay. Okay, amazing. So hello everyone. First of all, massive congratulations to both teams that ended up going to the grand finals of Western WSDC. Congrats to both teams. My name is Paula. I'm going to be your chair for this round. My preferred pronouns are she or her, but I do have a strong preference of you referring to the panel as a whole. And now I'm going to allow my panelists to introduce themselves. You can go in the order how it's written in Tabbycat.
Hi everyone, my name is Alice. Please do refer to the panel as a whole and best of luck for everyone.
Hi everyone, my name is Amitai. Massive congratulations as well. Best of luck in the round.
Hi everybody, I'm Diggory. Congratulations both teams. Good luck, have fun everybody.
Hi everyone, my name is Archimedes. Him gender pronouns, all the best in this round.
Hello, my name is Jerson. I go by any pronouns, and congratulations for making it to the grand finals. Sorry, I don't have a camera, but yes, that.
Reshab, are you here? Okay, so we are missing one panelist. That's unfortunate. Okay, so we're missing one panelist. I've tagged them in Discord. They're non-responsive. It's been 4 minutes. Someone from CAP, are you here? How should we proceed?
Yeah. Wait 1 more minute. And we'll see if there's another panelist that we can slot in. If not, then we might just do a 6-person panel.
Okay. Okay, amazing. So our last member of panel is Prosper Michael. Thank you so much for jumping in. Okay, would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Prosper Michael. I'm going to be a panelist on this round. All the best.
Okay, great. Then I think we should proceed with the round. I assume you guys are familiar with the housekeeping rules. I'm going to try my best to put timestamps in the chat, but I'm focused on writing notes, so I might miss it. So make sure to time yourselves and other speakers to know when to ask POIs. And yeah, that's it. Good luck, everyone. And without any further ado, I'm very happy to call upon Prime Minister. Here.
Amazing, thank you. I'm just going to turn off my camera for my speech because I tend to have Wi-Fi issues with my camera on. I also prefer POIs in chat. For an institution that claims to be truth-seeking, The universities of the status quo have failed. They deny true representation and genuine consideration of conservative perspectives, many of whom have legitimate concerns in the field of the humanities and the social sciences. On proposition, we think that predominantly liberal universities turn data into dogma and insights into indoctrination. We're proud to propose. Two things in my speech: firstly, setup, and then two constructive arguments. The first being why this policy generates far better academic engagement and research production within universities, and then secondly, on broad political discourse and polarization. Firstly, on setup, what do we support? We support a gradual integration of conservative faculty into left-leaning universities. That does not mean that we're going to suddenly introduce hundreds of conservative professors in a year. That is because it takes time. As a university grows and they make decisions on who to hire and who to keep for permanent tenure, that needs a long-term decision. But secondly, we can also be relatively reasonable in the kinds of conservative researchers and faculty that we have. If a researcher is advocating for genocide or is very clearly expressing a hatred for a group of people, we do not have to employ that individual. If they have a history of significant hate speech, for instance, we do not have any obligation to hire them. With that being said, on to our first constructive. Why does this policy generate far better academic engagement? At the top of this argument, I just want to characterize what the current political and academic situation looks like within universities. Currently, the amount of representation that the left gets in universities is excessive. It is disproportionate to the amount of numbers of left-leaning individuals that exist in society. That makes it impossible for genuine discourse to occur. And this is true for three reasons. Firstly, the dominance of left-wing ideology creates echo chambers within universities. It is a chamber in which students are too afraid to speak out and express genuine questions that they have about course material if those questions are conservative tinted, in fear of being canceled. And I want to note that this is a cyclical problem. This echo chamber only grows more extreme. It means any conservatively tinged question is denied on the grounds of racism or sexism. It means that left-wing students demand that their professors also to be left-wing. They demand the removal of any faculty that do not identify with their liberal beliefs. This all leads to a pernicious cycle of an echo chamber as a whole. But number two, left-wingers within these systems also automatically castrate other ideas that aren't necessarily left-wing. We as debaters do indeed try to engage in a relatively liberal bubble, but let's try our best to step out of our own biases. I think that many of these questions do deserve scrutiny. So for instance, when we're asking philosophical questions on whether or not affirmative action itself is truly equal or fair, whether transport itself is fair given biological imbalances, or if my menstrual cycle affects my psychology or my ability to climb the corporate ladder in the workforce, it looks like Black and conservative psychologists like Roland Fryer, who research the rates of poverty and single motherhood and crime in the Black community. These are all legitimate questions that perhaps are conservative leaning, but they do not get the scrutiny that they deserve in the status quo, and they're left out under opposition. But thirdly, new researchers never go to conservative research to begin with. They never try to ask those questions. The reason being that the editors of their journals are also liberal. The consumers and the demand from that journal is also liberal. And what that means is that there is a self-filtering mechanism in which researchers never even try to attempt to ask those questions in the very first place, insofar as they believe that they'll never actually get published. The implication is very simple. On opposition, that is a world in which there is only one dominant narrative that is legitimized. It is one in which there is an oversaturation of left-wing ideology, ignoring the host of other real areas and very legitimate areas of thought that exist in the conservative world. What is our solution on proposition? Firstly, we suggest that a countervailing force is necessary, i.e., a countervailing force against the dominant narrative, liberal narrative, by slowly introducing representation from conservative perspectives. And that also means we introduce a healthy form of discourse amongst students and researchers and faculty who now have those daily conversations within the classroom. But number two, in the same way that affirmative action is currently used in universities to increase the amount of representation in underprivileged groups and allow them to better express their thoughts, we use that same mechanism here. I want to note on a strategic level that this analysis is incredibly important. We've proven that the status quo has an excessive amount of liberalism within universities. This demands a countervailing force to balance it out. And that also means it is very unlikely that if opposition claims that there's going to be an excessive right-wing capture of universities that will lead to extremism. Why is this the most important consideration in this debate? Aside from the more nuanced conversations that we also get greater better reception to research to be applied in everyday life. So when that conservative research is created, more people are willing to engage on those questions. On opposition, i.e. many centrist policymakers and citizens are just doubtful about that university research to begin with. They believe it is politically tinged towards the left and it is biased, and therefore they never use it to apply it to their daily life. On our side of the house, thousands of new research questions are now considered, and that is so much more knowledge that is produced and actually applied to daily life. Before moving on to our second argument, I'll be happy to take a point.
Why can't right-leaning institutes create these research questions and research papers? Why must you introduce them into left-leaning institutes?
Number one, it is empirically true that the vast majority of academia within the humanities and in the social sciences is dominated by the left. See all the three reasons that I gave to you at the start of my argument. So number two, on political discourse and polarization, I just want to characterize the unwillingness of both sides of the political spectrum to meaningfully engage with the other in the status quo. This is often caused by alienation. For the average conservative, there is a natural response to feel reactionary, to feel heated at the point at which you are told that you do not belong at a university, that your beliefs are fundamentally flawed. You believe that the liberal elites have captured that institution of education, and you've been isolated from accessing another community of like-minded individuals. And that is incredibly harmful for a few reasons. One, when conservatives cannot find that community of others on campus, they go into insular communities to express their ideas. But those are now echo chambers. In milder instances, it looks like searching up for Ben Shapiro content or Brooks online following, in which many people do not say that in person, but they still consume that content. In more serious instances, it looks like you're going to 4chan, channeling your hatred through that community that you access online. But secondly, you have professors and faculty who try to shut down those universities because they themselves do not feel represented. It looks like Jordan Peterson at the University of Toronto, who claims he's advocating for free speech within his institution. And notably, this also makes centrists very distasteful of politics, who believe that this is filled with a game of silencing one another and mudslinging against the other. But lastly, conservatives themselves just become much more resentful, whether it's for minorities, whether it's for immigrants, for instance. They're much more likely to create extremist clubs on campus from groups based on that hate because of the alienation and the resentment that they have pent up within themselves. This is also incredibly important because under our side, we do not necessarily force right-wing faculty and students to go underground to create insular clubs filled with hate, but because most people do not start from a place of hate in radicalism, because but even if they were radicals, we would prefer that they show their opinions in public under our side of the house, in which people can refute their ideas and actually listen. The comparative on op is one in which they become further radicalized when they feel isolated and that they do not belong in that community of academia as a whole. It is on that basis we're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for this very fine speech, and I'm happy to call upon leader of op. Here.
Hi, can I check that I'm visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. I would like verbal POIs, please. On opposition, we do not support the implementation of affirmative action for conservatives in hiring and tenure decisions in predominantly left of center or left-wing facilities. On our side, models for accountability in research still exist. We think checks and balances, like peer reviews, which reaches out to professors across the spectrum of political ideology, exist. Therefore, academic research on our side can still be called into question if it is inaccurate or biased to encourage further discourse and discussion. Thirdly, I want to note and be clear that there's a difference between being partisan and being biased. Having a value judgment on an issue does not make you unfairly biased. Similarly, there's a distinction between inaccuracy and bias. Academic research, for instance, can have a view without being factually wrong. Fourthly, proposition thus needs to prove two things in this debate. One, that they can actually hire qualified professors to fill the job. And secondly, that there's a value to having these conservative views, specifically in university faculties, when differing perspectives already exist in wider academia and within the academic industry as a whole. A few points of rebuttal then. Firstly, their entirety of the first and second argument are based on a weird characterization of what these universities actually look like. They said all universities have excessive representation of left wing in their faculties. That is obviously not true. As long as there's a demand for right wing research into right wing ideology, which likely exists given that there are still right wing political parties and right wing corporations in status quo, this means there will still be funding for right wing universities and right wing professors to conduct their research. As long as there's a demand for this kind of information and knowledge, there will be a supply of this in universities. It's merely an assertion that currently we have no right wing institutions whatsoever.
Go on.
There is conservative representation already, even within left-wing universities. Their own example of Roland Fryer is turned against them because Roland Fryer is literally the youngest tenured professor in Harvard, which is known to be a left-wing university as well. So their own example refutes their point. But even if demand is overly liberal, within people and universities are entitled to their own opinions. If you need more liberal ideas and more explanations for them, then universities should by all means go and research these things. Then they try to say that, well, if you're conservative, it means you have racist echo chambers. Just because you're conservative doesn't mean you're racist. You be conservative because you prefer older forms of economic models, for instance. It doesn't mean you have to be racist. That's just a stereotype that they threw onto this group of people. Then they said that, well, you professors don't want to be engaged and don't want to respond to conservative views otherwise. That is obviously not true. For professors to gain legitimacy and reputation, they need to engage with opposing points of views that try to falsifies their own views to prove that they're able to triumph above other professors and above other views. Therefore, they have an active incentive to engage with opposing views outside their faculties on our side of the house. Finally, the argument they try to say it's empirically true that all universities are leftist, and I try to give you 3 reasons. I'm going to give you a strategic observations. Those 3 reasons were impacts. They have never ever tried to explain to us in their first speech why it's empirically true that all universities are just leftist on their side. Their first argument is out. The second argument was on polarization. Again, this is hinged on the characterization of universities, which they failed to defend. But furthermore, they said, well, people are going to be hurt and silenced because on their side, hate clubs will form. But if you know about universities, you will know that universities ban clubs that are extremists and ban clubs that incite hate. In their own policy, they said they won't hire professors who will be extremists and spread hate within the university. So obviously this will apply to student organizations as well. It is for these reasons that on their side of the house, even if there are students who are incredibly right-wing, for example, and they go into these, and then we think they're unlikely to even go into these left-leaning universities in the first place, and rather go to right-leaning universities as well. So on that point on being isolated and silenced, I don't think that's relevant to this debate. It is for these reasons that both of the arguments are out. First argument then, on why proposition uniquely lowers the quality of academia. The premise of this argument is that institutions have natural incentives to be non-partisan anyway. It is for 2 very simple reasons. One, if you're non-partisan, you attract funding from both the left and the right political spectrum, from both corporations and political parties. That's a lot of money. Secondly, you attract both left and right students from both the left and right political spectrum. That gives you diversity that allows you to climb up on the university rankings. That is a good thing. The question in this debate, therefore, is why is it that we have predominantly left-leaning universities in the first place? And we think, given that most universities have no incentives to be discriminatory in the hiring practices, then we think it's probably because most people prefer to go to other universities. Most people who are left-leaning would just prefer to go to these universities, maybe because they're situated in places which have historically voted left for a very long period of time. Maybe these universities produced politicians who eventually went into leftist political parties. The upshot is just that it's unlikely that discriminatory hiring practices cause this phenomena. Therefore, the implication of this is significant because that means that on their side of the house, with them to attract more conservative professors into their institutions, they have to lower the metrics for hiring to get all those people, to get some people in. Because the best conservative professors, the most reputable ones, and the students who are the most interested in conservative right-wing ideology are likely to go to right-wing universities anyway. So for them to be able to have professors in this department on their side, in left-leaning universities, they need to lower the metrics for hiring so they actually get people. The reason why this is is twofold. No, thank you. First of all, they decrease the quality of education at the point at which these curriculums are conducted by inexperienced and unreputable professors. But second of all, after these professors enter into the faculty, we then have no incentive to further self-improve because their tenure is lifelong. They don't need to do anything and they'll be guaranteed an income for the rest of their life. Therefore, the impacts are significant. Firstly, on proposition, they don't raise the quality of research or discussion in these universities. In fact, they decrease student performance at the point at which these people are not even be able to sit in the classes of certified and educated professors. But second of all, they incur up costs because on their other side of the house, we can spend all of those money spent on affirmative action, on hiring actually better professors and improving the quality of education holistically across all faculties as a whole within the university. But finally, the confirmation bias, hold on, because on their side of the house, if they hire conservative professors who are less qualified, then it just confirms the perception that conservatism and right-wing leaning ideologies are just somehow inferior to left-wing ideologies, which decreases incentive of people to want to engage on their side of the house. Before I move on to my second argument, yes.
We never claim that all universities have an excessive left-wing bias, but rather in the places where this motion itself is set, which is universities with left-leaning departments, there is an excessive amount of left-wing support in those academic areas. That is also a reason why being partisan is impossible, given that the motion is set in left-wing departments.
Okay, I understand what you mean, but the reason why this observation cuts your case is because all your point about polarization, about feeling scared, about being hated on, doesn't apply, given that you concede right-wing universities and centrist universities also exist. Back to my argument on why they create a veneer of objectivity. The premise is on their side, the conservatives brought in by affirmative action are unlikely to make a significant impact, because on their side of the house, left-wing universities will still be funded by left-wing alumnus and left-wing political parties. This means on their side, these donors can fund the left-wing research, can give left-wing researchers more funding and deplete funding for right-wing researchers, given that they control the funding for research. This means that on their side, even if conservatives do exist within these faculties, the quality of research goes down. Less journals want to publish their research, which further justifies these donor decisions to fund them less and less over long periods of time. Secondly, it's also likely that these people will be drowned out, given that they're likely to be a minority within these universities. And finally, they also have no incentive to call out unbiased research by left-wing professors on their side of the house, given that they have no power in this university dominated by people of another ideology, and also given that they are reliant on these people to work together to create a conducive work environment for themselves. It's for these reasons that conservatives will be powerless on their side of the house, and secondly, people won't even know that they're powerless and believe in this veneer of objectivity. It's for these reasons we're very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank Leader of the Opposition for this very fine speech, and I'm happy to call upon DPM.
I'll take PYs in the chat. Opposition realized they couldn't beat our case on the merits, so they try and turn it into a mud fight. I will be very clear with my clarifications on why we are still ahead. Two things to note. Firstly, why are universities predominantly left-wing? And I want to give two reasons here. The first is that just empirically, there are very few right-wing institutions, and most of them can't penetrate the field of academia where peer review is important. We've given you research and already a lot of analysis explaining why social science and humanities turn towards the left. I don't know what to say to the opposition. This is just empirically true, and you probably already know that panel. I'll challenge them to name a single right-wing university that is mainstream and as popular. We could probably give dozens more examples of them, like the Ivy League, state universities in America, and many, many more. And the structural reason behind this is that conservative professors are thrown out for giving campus talks. This has been due to trends in critical race theory, postmodernism, and other overtly leftist trends, but also just due to the fact that most universities are composed of youth, which tend to hold more progressive-leaning ideologies. Again, I challenge them to name a single example. Secondly, their magic bullet is the words peer-reviewed. Many of our claims already prove why peer-reviewed checks are flawed, that many of these projects are never even given funding in the first place. So it doesn't matter what the final product is given, they never even start that research at the offset. Two questions why we win then. Firstly, we improve the quality of research. Secondly, we improve the quality of discourse. Firstly, why do we improve the quality of research? They claim that institutions will be nonpartisan on either side because they will get funded from corporations. The problem here is that this is just not true. There are no very good right-wing institutions for the reasons we have given you. Secondly, the problem is that most universities don't get a lot of their funding from corporations. They get funding from students, like Panel. Where do you think Ohio State University gets the bulk of their funding from? Like Apple or from tuition fees? But thirdly and finally, Even if they get nonpartisan checks and balances on either side, they don't work to serve for many biases we have explained on why through the process of research, you are much more likely to skew to liberal conclusions. Their next claim is that they waste a lot of money trying to find good conservative professors. But the reason for why this is not true is because currently there is an overtly leftist bias, which has left many very qualified conservative professors not hired. So if anything, this will likely not cost as much money as they claim it will. Finally, I want to bring back our claim here and explain why there's a propensity for better research on our side. We have already explained there is a giant gap for social science research. Important conservative questions are not asked. Whether minority communities have disproportionately higher rates of gang violence, research into sports and biological performance of trans athletes, or even philosophical research on the rights of the fetus. They say that values have nothing to do with bias. Yes, they do, because that determines how the process of research happens, what direction you go based on the existing thoughts you have. When liberal researchers do conservative research, they are far more likely to try and fit the conclusion to their liberal positions and biases. When they're selecting data points for gang violence trends, they might purposefully outlie and cut minority communities in fear of being accused of racist, which means these perspectives are not considered. It leads to wrong research results to the charities and wrong information to policymakers. Finally, I will be overly charitable and assume that conservative research exists and that people will not be biased. Even then, the receptivity to the research of universities will be far more skeptical from the general public who believe it to be a vessel of the far left. Again, their only implicit response is that there are right-wing institutions who can do this research, but we have given you many reasons why the entire world of academia skews to the left. But furthermore, many of our research still proves that liberal institutions can help funding and can help research, but currently they take overtly liberal positions. Like ideally, we don't have any like liberal institutions and conservative institutions. We have mixed institutions in which both kinds of research can be conducted with no kinds of bias at all, no response from their side. The weighing of this argument. Perhaps the most important contribution of universities is their research, which is used by advisors and bureaucrats. It is information given to policymakers that will determine whether they legislate for the right things, whether minority communities receive the most effective kinds of support from welfare, whether doctors employ the most scientifically correct methods. This argument on scale applies to a massive amount of people, not just air impacts of people in universities, but our impacts of people in the entire society, in the political sphere, who are now affected by social science policy. Already on the magnitude of the argument, we are ahead. The final thing I want to do is point out why we are ahead on discourse as well. Even if you believe their argument that right-wing universities exist, we still want more right-wing views in leftist places. Many conservatives, for instance, can't just pick and choose the closest right-wing university. They are forced to go to their local state university that is leftist due to tuition costs or geographical location. Like, they just can't imagine a perfect world where every conservative goes to a conservative institution and every liberal goes to a liberal institution. That is ridiculous and in practice won't happen. But secondly, let's take this argument at their best and assume that now these people are segmented and in their own respective institutions. That just concedes all of Kaylee's arguments, explaining why discourse is going to be so much worse, on why, for instance, when there are radical echo chambers in these right-wing institutions, that's what leads to even more radicalization. And once they reach sufficient radicalization, that translates into direct physical harm. They are very, very alienated. They feel very harmed. And there as a result, they are much more likely to go against the establishment and do things like create hate crimes against minorities. The final thing I want to do here is also explain the weighing of our discourse argument. Kaylee already gave many reasons why it is cyclical and compounds into itself, which means that over time, if you don't have any single conservative professors at all with our policy, this slowly will get worse and worse and worse, which means that in the long term, there will be even more greater amounts of radicalization. So that is a long-term weighing, which is better. Before I continue, POI.
Why would right-wing views ever gain traction in an environment that's overly dominated by left-wing discourse?
So it's subtle. Like, for instance, it's gradual. Over time, citizens and these people in these universities realize that they can talk to this conservative professor instead of going to these very radical institutions. They have someone they can lean on, someone they can talk about their concerns or about their genuine political views, which we have proven are legitimate in the first place. Like, I just don't believe your world's conception in which all of the liberal people go to the liberal institution, all of the conservative people go to the conservative institution. That by definition is what polarization is. Now, I want to talk more about the weighing here. Let's be clear. Their argument, they might talk about, for instance, like minority harms. Many people in liberal institutions are uncomfortable that conservatives are there. We have already given you several reasons why we can already preliminary sort for them. Let's be clear. These conservative people will not have very radical or racist views. But even if they do, we would rather them actually have those views in the public sphere. And the reason for why is a fewfold. Firstly, Having their views in the public sphere means you can deplatform them. Many of these people are youth. They are illusioned. They are alienated because they have never had the chance to talk about their actual legitimate grievances. And on our side, when they talk about them in the public sphere, they at least can now have discourse, de-radicalize them, and make them far better. But furthermore, the actions of sufficiently radicalized conservatives cause physical harm. I will note, it's not just like 4chan and these radical networks. It's literally their side's concession that these people will go to radical right-wing research institutions. That is a huge concession that many of these people will become further radicalized, and that is very, very bad. The final thing I want to do here is explain why this is a uniquely beneficial benefit for our side. Physical harm is a much more important impact than emotional harm. We have given you reasons why over time, radicalization propels the things like the January 6th riots, in which people cause direct physical harm to other people. Not only does this cause a higher magnitude of suffering, but this also creates a signaling effect in which minorities are afraid to go out in the streets because they are afraid of having their hijab ripped off. It's when people no longer feel safe in their homes because they might get guns shot at them. That is an independent reason for our side. Finally, a new mechanism about funding. Universities require lots of money. The problem is that these liberal institutions will never receive as much conservative donors. Conservative donors usually have more money than liberal donors because the richer tend to align with right-wing policies that oppose redistribution. This is just empirically true. So on our side, given the fact that these liberal institutions will have far less funding on their side, they have less of a capacity to go into good research, less of a capacity to actually look into social science, and as a result, many more people are harmed. Predominantly liberal universities turn data into dogma and insights into indoctrination. We are very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you, DPM, for that very fine speech, and I'm happy to call upon Diallo.
PYs verbally, please. They make two assumptions that make the case null from the get-go. The first assumption is in their first argument, where they assume that entirely the left have exclusive and excessive representation in the social sciences and in the humanities. Notice then that all the three mechanisms in the first argument are mechanisms. They're just impacts. So if I can take this out, their argument is gone. But their own examples defeat their point. Roland Fryer, for instance, their shiny bright example of conservative representation was actually a point for our side because he was the one who was included in Howard's tenure and the youngest ever tenure professor. So when it came to things like saying there's no empirical examples, there are. Economics, for instance, has debates over the minimum wage, over taxation, and over welfare. There's nothing to do with racism and sexism, and are very prominent debates that split between the right wing and the left wing. So the structural reasons we gave you as to why there is representation is twofold. First, that you want novel ideas to claim them as institutions so you can get that first mover advantage. Second, that you want to attract people and funding from across the spectrum. So their first argument is out. Their burden in this debate, therefore, was to prove why objectivity in academia wasn't enough. Why you needed objectivity specifically within the specific institution. The second assumption is the second argument, where they assume a characterization of society that is not actually transposable to people in academia, that you drive conservatives underground. This is not true. There's a structural incentive not to drive them underground to attract more people for the money that they claim is very important to universities. So this is out of the debate. First question on objectivity before a second clash on quality of education. First, on objectivity. And the premise is they need to counterbalance the left. They turn on us to give empirical examples. I've already done that, so that's out of this debate. But I want you to observe the comparative on our side. It is one where there's engagement in academia as well. There are reasons why we gave you as to why novelty means that there's an incentive to do so, and you engage because they are peer-reviewed papers, for instance. You have to give responses and defend your ideas in order for them to be considered in a good light. Why didn't they say that universities are predominantly left-wing? They assert this empirically true. That is not the case. Chicago, for instance, has an economics department that is pretty right-wing and generated people like Milton Friedman, for instance, or the Cato Institute. So, secondly then, I don't take them in the best and rope by the reasons they give. The first reason is that they say the youth are predominantly left-wing. This is generally not true, and based on a very caricatured assumption. There are conservatives as well, because conservative ideas are not just racism and sexism, they can be economic things or general valid ideas as well. Second, they say they're thrown off campus, but they're only thrown off campus for egregious cases of offense and not for espousing valid ideas with genuine ideology and genuine backing. So that's probably a good thing. The next thing they say then is whether or not values have bearing on research. I want to make two observations that take this out entirely. First is that partisanship is not the same as bias. In many cases, academic papers require you to espouse a stance on a specific issue. That is not the same as saying there are biases that affect how you cherry pick data, because in those cases, inaccurate data can be pointed out very easily by peer reviews, for instance, so just out of this debate. But I want to flip this argument. If it is true that biases have a bearing on research, then presumably it is better on our side, because you know, heading into the institution and reading the institution's research, that there is a partisan bias, that there is a partisan leaning. So you're more aware and more critical and better able to pick it out. That is the argument they didn't respond to coming out from Melina. Why then is a comparative better? Because their objectivity is a veneer of objectivity instead of actual objectivity. We give you three reasons as to why it's ineffective that they don't respond to. One, that's unlikely to get funding from the university for espousing right-wing ideals. Two, that their voices are drowned out. And third, they have no incentive to speak up because they already have the job because of a system of affirmative action. Then this takes out the argument entirely, because veneer objectivity is bad for many reasons. The first is, in many cases, it affects how people make their choices when consuming their literature and makes the community less critical, which is exactly the outcome that we flip on their side. The last thing I want to engage then is funding. I want to engage with this directly because their claim is that there's no funding because it comes from students, first of all. I want to point out this also outside comparative, because as we tell you, universities have an incentive naturally to cater to both sides to get students. So the question you need to ask is, when it happens that universities have a specific leaning to a specific side, it's probably because conservatives probably self-select to not join those universities for very valid reasons. What's they say in the third argument is that you decrease funding from corporations. This is very uncomparative. On their side, traditionally liberal institutions have to abandon all sorts of liberal funding that they already get. Comparatively, conservative institutions and conservative-leaning institutions will get all the funding. On their side, it is load of no funding. Again,
Gang. Gang. Yeah. This is the grand finals.
Sorry, I stopped your time. But,
yeah, sorry. I got muted by the host.
No, it's fine. I'm sorry this happened. Okay, so everyone who is spectating, please make sure that you're muted, because it's very rude and disrespectful to talk and interrupt people while we're debating finals. Okay, I have the stopwatch stopped at 4 minutes and 18 seconds. I can just continue.
Yeah, sure. In that case. Second question on quality. And our argument here was that on their side, this is entirely ineffective and actually decreases the quality of education. The reason why is threefold. First of all, conservatives have no power because they get no funding. Second, they get drawn out. Third, they have no incentive to call out because it jeopardizes their job. So there's no real objectivity on their side. What are the impacts of this? First of all, people are less critical when reading papers, as I've already mentioned. But second, and more importantly, when conservatives in these positions of power espouse poor ideals and performs of research, students are less incentive to actually trust them and they have less credibility. This is important because strategically, their arguments of more objectivity from students and from research only manifest if there's a genuine quality of education that students are critically believe in. So what is the comparative then? They say this is gradual and students realize over time. This is premised on professors displaying their effectiveness and quality, which is unlikely to happen if they are guaranteed a job regardless. And we explained to you that the reason why you often pick unqualified professors is because in many cases, there's a natural incentive to select for non-partisan professors. So when it happens that the institution has one political leaning, it is probably because they couldn't get the people that they wanted. So they have to lower the bar and they have to lower the standards. So this is out of the debate. We flip the argument directly here on the quality of education. And that is the premise of the case. They need to do better on that. But the next thing they say is that this is important as information to legislators. Our response to this is that if it is true that this informs political information and political decisions, it is even more important to know the biases. And it is even more important to have partisanship and to have partisan leanings in exclusive institutions. And the reason why is because in many cases, they inform the political decisions that people make. I'll elaborate on this in my third argument and flag you when I get there. The last point they make is some polarization that people mix in institutions. We explain why this is actually a point for our side. So when it doesn't happen, it's probably because they self-select. But their weighing here is very strange. They say it's better to have views in public than the underground. This is not relevant at all. We made no argument on harming minorities. But second of all, if being shamed was a bad thing, then it's because it's ineffective, and people get shamed is ineffective because they're tenured. So in many cases, this is out of the debate. Gen 6, for instance, is not an example of academia. You need to engage on where this debate actually takes place. At best, this is symmetric. At worst, this goes to us. Third argument then, this worsens politics. Before that, yes.
If you want liberal institutions and right-wing institutions to be separated, liberals will make liberal biases, right-wings will make right-wing biases. Peer review can't solve for this. These are mistakes when selecting what to research.
Correct. So because peer review solves for biases often do not mean inaccuracies, and partisanship is a valid point to hold. Okay, so the premise of the argument is that academia and politics are intertwined. I think they concede to this to a large degree because their point is that in many cases, academia actually informs political decisions. In many cases, for instance, students go on to become involved in politics. Professors, for instance, are consulted, and research is consulted by politicians. Partisanship, therefore, is good for two reasons if it is true that they intertwine with politics. The first is that it informs funding decisions. It allows people or boards giving grants to speak out in their own way and to express their own political opinions and support the research that they want to come out from their side. That is a perfectly valid way to use your money and a perfectly valid way to vote with your dollar. Second of all, you need justifications for political stances. In many cases, these justifications come from explicitly knowing which institutes are for which side, so you can observe the stances for both sides and evaluate them in a fair and just manner. These are valid stances, not biases, as they carefully point out for me in their POI. So the strategy in this debate is this. First of all, we prove to you, and they concede, that in fact, bias and inaccuracy are not synonymous with partisanship. What that then means is that their claims on cherry-picking examples fall out of this debate. They need to give better reasons as to why they need objectivity in institutions. Second of all, we prove to you there's objectivity elsewhere. Like, for instance, different institutions of different partisan biases, or different partisan stances rather, clashing with each other in papers and in exchanges. They need to prove why specifically representations in institutions is needed when it can be done between institutions. For all those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank Diolo for that very fine speech. And then again, reminder, everyone who is observing this, make sure that you are muted because it's interrupting speakers when you speak and it's just rude, so don't do it. Thank you, speaker, so much. And now I am very happy to call upon Government Whip. Here.
Cool. Can you guys hear me? Cool. I want to start the speech with an investigation of why the CA set this motion. Why do we implement affirmative action for certain groups? For instance, we don't implement affirmative action quotas for female politicians in parliament if females are already adequately represented in parliament. Clearly, we have quotas for groups that are underrepresented, and I think it is very telling of their side of the House that they choose to not engage with our entire case. Rather, they choose to engage with the fact that the motion was even set in the first place. I think the reason that we are debating this is because it's just an empirical fact that conservative thought is underrepresented in institutions of higher learning. That is uncontentious. That is the reason the motion exists. They cannot run from that core trade-off. I'm going to chat about two things in this speech. First, how does this motion affect discourse in universities? And second, how does this affect research in universities? First, how does this affect discourse? Here's what we told you. We said universities were extremely dominated by liberals. There were leftist extremist ideals that were cast as truisms, and conservatives were thus too afraid to speak. They were in fear that they would be canceled, scared that they were deemed bigoted, scared that they would get marks from their majority left-wing professors. And this led them to turn to 4chan, to Ben Shapiro, to Turning Point USA, and to potentially even commit hate crimes against liberal institutions, commit hate crimes against minority students. Their response to this is there is sufficient right-wing ideology in these campuses. First, clearly there isn't. That's the reason we're having this debate. But second, I think they make a number of concessions throughout their entire case that actually implicate that conservatives are underrepresented. First, they concede that Harvard, the most famous university in the world, is a left-leaning institution when talking about Roland Flyer. Second, their argument on the veneer of objectivity says that conservatives do nothing because they're the minority of professors. That concedes that conservatives are the minority, right? That concedes that there isn't enough representation of both sides of the political spectrum. So for their first argument about the veneer of objectivity to even function in the first place, they have to concede that one group is not as represented as the other. I'd also note that their first argument is actually a non-argument. Their argument just says your policy does nothing, and then there's a veneer that your policy does something. If we can prove that our policy has practical impacts, that argument goes out of the debate. We have three reasons on our side of the House how we actually solve the problem of polarization on campuses. Number one, that you challenge liberal beliefs. And I think it's very ironic that we're having a debate right now about this, and opposition side of the House is the one that is actively curtailing debate. I think having different views on college campuses is a good thing because different viewpoints can interact with each other. They can have positive discourse like we are doing right now, and they can try and determine the truth. Even if these conservative viewpoints are ones that you don't believe in, at least you can help those viewpoints can help you strengthen your own beliefs because you can only solidify You can only solidify your beliefs by, like, having them interact with other ones. Some famous debater once said, you can verify truth through its collision with error. Secondly, we think we encourage conservative discourse on our side of the house. So no longer do conservatives on their side no longer want to, speak out their voices on college campuses, and no longer do they turn to those underground sources of discourse, but we de-radicalize them from 4chan to Andrew Tate, and we make them talk in college campuses. We make them talk with their students. We make them talk with their professors. And we filter out the most hateful and bigoted stuff because there still is public accountability. If these conservatives decide to say racist stuff, if they decide to say bigoted stuff, they're still going to get public accountability on their side of the house. But what we get is that we get these people no longer being afraid to have discourse. We allow these people to speak their mind, talk about their beliefs, and we think that is good for discourse in general. And third, I think that there is a symbolic benefit to universities doing this, which got no refutation from their side of the house. We think that you actually indicate to conservatives, to traditionalists, that universities are willing to represent all viewpoints. You also indicate to centrists, supporters of free speech, that you are willing to have people of different opinions. Look at how Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson videos of them speaking at university campuses and then getting kicked out unjustly get millions of views on YouTube. These end up de-radicalizing a lot of people, a lot of centrists, a lot of young, impressionable people that think that the left-wing establishment does not want to engage in differing viewpoints. We think that what this policy does is it actually shows these people that those viewpoints get debunked. More conservatives enter the space. More conservatives speak their mind. That means more discourse occurs on our side of the house. And they only have one response to this. This response is incredibly telling of their case. They say, why will these viewpoints gain traction if liberal people have a majority? They don't need to gain traction. They just need to be present. I think the existence of viewpoints that don't agree with you is important for universities. As institutions of higher learning, they're supposed to allow students to challenge their ideology. You shouldn't be in a university and just hear things that you agree with. You shouldn't enter a college classroom and just hear lectures that you agree with. You shouldn't talk to people in the dining hall and just hear opinions that you agree with. The important thing that exists on our side of the house is people are able to have things that challenge your viewpoints. That is especially good. Go ahead.
The motion is about faculties that are left-leaning. Why is it that this would imply that all faculties would be left-leaning on our side of the house?
It doesn't. The majority of faculties are left-leaning, but in the faculties that are left-leaning, our policy is good. I don't understand that, POI. Second thing, how does this impact research in universities? I think this is incredibly important. You cannot have research in a university that ultimately crowds out one side of the political spectrum. You can't have research through the myopic lens of liberalism while crowding out differing ideologies. And this is incredibly important. For the Latin American person who, for example, family escapes socialism, and then they come to these universities who worship socialism as a correct ideology, for African Americans who denounce crime rates and violent crime in their communities, and for religious minorities whose scriptures talk about the morality of abortion and other practices that are thought of as truisms in these universities, it is incredibly insulting to insinuate to these people that there is only one correct opinion. We think we fix this in three core ways. First, these universities are willing to talk about important topics, like the philosophy of abortion, like, for example, the biology of transgender people competing in sports, or the sociology behind high poverty rates. Second, that you're able to draw important conclusions from them. And their response here is like, no, you don't get enough funding, right? These universities don't get enough funding, and that is their third argument. I think Neil's third argument also clashes with this very well. We get more funding actually on our side of the house. First, because conservative donors are more likely to be wealthier. And second, because these donors still care about prestige, right? So liberal donors will still donate to Harvard. And then on our side of the house, you get more conservative donors to Harvard. So that's more money for universities, more money to do research. Secondly, you get more important conclusions on our side of the house. This is really, really important because the problem is a lot of these sociological and humanity issues are just deemed as like too hot button issues for like liberals to cover. For instance, there's a very common stat that's cited amongst conservatives and some racist conservatives that African-American people are 15% of the population, but they commit 50% of all murders. Liberal universities would be far too scared to mention this, right? Because they don't want to be seen as racist or controversial. But these issues do not mean that we cannot draw like productive conclusions from them. Like a racist person might be like, use this as a foundation for their political ideology, but somebody who is progressive might be like, this proves that there is underfunding of education and welfare in these communities. This proves the impacts of structural racism that date back hundreds of years. And this proves that, like, the presence of drug and violent crime in these communities is something that is harmful. The point is that even if you have conservative research, it doesn't mean you can't draw liberal conclusions from that. Just because you have people that disagree with you doesn't mean that they have to be outright destroyed in your political spectrum. I think it is incredibly important on our side of the house to have people that disagree with you, because for the same reason that we are having this debate, having your opinions challenged is good. And finally, we think there is more buy-in to these studies at the end of the day. A lot of liberal institutions, left-leaning institutions, will publish very important and very groundbreaking research just to be ignored by half of the political spectrum because they don't agree with the professors. But on our side of the house, when you see that the author line has 2 or 3 conservative professors that you actually believe in and you actually think are like worth of their salt, then you will actually like right-wing people will actually like read those studies. They'll actually look at that research and they will actually buy onto this important information. On our side of the house, we increase the legitimacy of universities when they're now seen as cross-partisan and being important. Their final response here is on peer review. I think we significantly deal with peer review through Neil's speech when we say that peer review happens after the publication, but they just don't get funding in the first place. These issues are seen as too hot button in the first place, and conservative professors are just not incentivized to join the sphere in the first place. It is on our side of the house that we encourage people to talk with people that don't agree with them. That's the same reason we are here today. I think that spirit continuing to universities means that discourse is ultimately better. On all of these grounds, we're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the very fine speech, and I'm happy to call up opposition my peer here.
Hi, can I be seen and heard?
Yeah.
I'll take POIs verbally. Opposition loses this debate for 2 reasons. One, that they have a woeful conception of academia, because throughout this debate, they've never explained why having your ideas challenged is enough for it to generate actual productive discourse. We question this down the line where Alina gives you 3 structural reasons for why this is likely to be ineffective and cause a veneer of objectivity. No response. I'll unpack this later in my speech. But second, because they overclaim their impacts, because this debate was never about the January 6 Capitol riots or about extremist groups, because if their side could ban professors who are likely to have hate speech, we could also ban the formation of extremist student groups, and we think we will also do this. So this debate was never about these extreme situations, it was about academia, it's about how it forms. I'm going to prove to you that on both of these grounds, we win. I want to ask 3 questions in this speech. 1, what are the universities we are talking about? 2nd, is this effective? 3rd, on harming academia and discourse. First, what are universities we talking about? Their thought experiment in the previous speaker is disingenuous, because just because conservative thought is underrepresented doesn't mean it's underrepresented in all higher institutes, just as it's underrepresented in left-leaning institutes, which we agree with. So this thought experiment was useless and obsolete. But the logic of their side is that there's a dearth of research from conservative and right-wing institutions. This is not true. And the structural reason for this, right, is just, if you think about it, 50% of the population is right-wing. And if it's true there are genuine concerns and issues raised by right wings, then presumably there's increased demand and there's supply to meet this demand to make sure that these research papers are published out. So right now, things like the Cato Institute in the economics of libertarian thought all have research to prove that this is true. They say, well, we create a polarized society. No. Our claim was that most universities are mixed, having both left-wing and right-wing students. This debate happens in the extremes when left-wing institutes form. We question why they form and prove that having one right-wing affirmative action conservative does nothing to benefit their case. They misrepresent our case, they lose this debate. Why then is this ineffective? Second clash. We think it's ineffective for a few reasons, but I want to listen to the language they say, because they say you don't need to gain traction, you just need to be present, and having your opinions challenged at face value is a good thing. This feeds in our argument, because our argument is very clear. They create a veneer of objectivity in these left-leaning institutes that can never be achieved. We give you 3 structural reasons of why you can never actually achieve objective and balanced academic discourse. 1, because these voices of conservatives are likely to be drowned out, because the majority is still left-leaning. They say they want to phase out in a slow manner, but if they want to phase out in a slow manner, then presumably for the majority of the time, they don't actually get say. No, thank you. 2nd, because they don't get funding from these left-leaning institutions that fund these universities. So for instance, if a right-wing professor wants to publish a paper on right-wing ideology, the left-leaning corporation and students who support these institutions won't fund it either ways. And 3rd, because professors have no incentive to speak up because they already got the job. I want to know why this is important. This is important because they create an ineffective system of getting opinions heard. They say, well, you just need opinions there and we're able to create change slowly. But this pseudo contact theory was never proven and never actually mechanized on their side of the house. So here's why it's bad. Because for all of the reasons they say, you create a veneer of objectivity. People think that these institutes are objective and these institutes are balanced in discourse, but it's only in name and not in practice. So it means on their side of the house, when people look at research papers from these institutes, they assume that they are balanced and they are objective, but in reality, they are still biased to left-leaning institutes. Our comparative was far more simple, that people recognize the biases of left-leaning institutes, that they knew that they're left-leaning and they recognized their biases. They were able to compare and critically evaluate and weigh the biases of right-wing papers and left-wing papers, and that's how we get objective and good change. This feeds into Hautian's second speaker argument, where we also told you where we're able to increase justifications for political partisanship, and he never really responded to this, which makes this argument debate winning. So at the end of this clash, I want to unpack why this is important. Because having one tokenistic professor isn't going to do anything to help increase discourse within these left-wing universities. Our strategy then was very clear, that there was already discourse and discourse about left and right-wing ideologies within the field, because the humanities and social science was a broad field, because peer review meant that you had to talk and discuss other papers, because responding to papers was an important way to gain your reputability and give things like citations. You cannot engage with arguments in a vacuum and become reputable. This is not how academia works. What all of this means then is that they needed to explain specifically why you needed objectivity within a left-leaning institute and not objectivity in the whole field that we have. They haven't met this burden, they lose this debate. With that, third clash on harming academia. And this clash has been really messy because it asserts a lot of impacts they don't really prove. So I want to really walk through how left-wing institutes actually function on both sides of the house. But before that, sure.
Peer review, which is your only response so far, is imperfect at best. Many of these decisions are subtle, like what dataset you select from, what outliers you remove. How do you make sure that bias is not intrinsic?
Peer review isn't our only mechanism. We say if academia and professors want to be reputable, they cannot misrepresent statistics, because then no one will cite their paper because they know they are misrepresenting statistics. It's not that hard to figure out. We think they need a better response to that. So how do left-wing institutes actually function on our side? First, on student interaction. It isn't true that there'll be echo chambers because they need to engage in opposing views. Because the whole point of higher institutes is to engage in opposing views to justify your own beliefs. There's a whole point of higher institutions. But I think professors also write responses to other professors and other researchers in the sphere of academia. And this is where their woeful knowledge of what academic research actually shows. Because the way professors gain credibility is by writing responses to people on the other side of the ideology to show why those beliefs aren't true. So there's still an engagement on both student and professor levels. Second, on academic research. And here's why they cannot get force-fit statistics. Because by force-fitting statistics, you get called out, you lose your reputation. I want to note here that reputation is very important to these professors, because that's how they get funding, that's how they get citations, that's how they get collaborations with other professors in other spheres of this academia. So this reputation is a very important check and balance mechanism to make sure they don't force-feed these statistics. Third, about right-wing students on our side. They say they'll go to 4chan. Here's a few reasons why this isn't true. One, most right-wing students go to either mixed universities or universities which are leaning right-wing. They haven't proven why this is likely. Second, because the left wing's fundamental value is to protect student voice, it's unclear why they'll shame them. Third, you also have no incentive to shame these students because you detract the students going to your university. If you're known for shaming right-wing students, then you decrease the number of students that will enter, decreasing funding for the university. But here's the flip. If it's true that right-wing students get shamed, then professors who enter these universities on their side also get shamed. So they have no actual change on their side of the house if this was the mechanism that they wanted to rely their only harm on. Their case cuts both ways. So we aren't saying we create a polarized system where everyone went to either left or right, but most people went to mixed universities. This debate was about the extreme, and they've never proven the tipping point. What then happens on their side of the house? I think on their side, left-leaning institutes looked like this. One, are professors. The professors are of lower quality. And here's why they don't respond to Alina's mechanism. We told you that there's a self-selection at play here, that these left-leaning institutes became left-leaning because right-wing professors simply didn't want to go there. Because note, most institutes want to be bipartisan because they get more funding. And this reason was what they told you, which concedes to our mechanism. So the only reason why institutes become left-leaning is if they cannot get professors to enter there in the first place. This means a lower standard of professors entering these places. This is important because a lower standard of professors means a lower quality of education. You mean you create a confirmation bias that is also harmful and pernicious to the validation of right-wing concerns. Because on their side of the house, left-wing students see these right-wing professors not being able to justify their values and ideas and not being able to teach properly, and therefore say, aha, these right-wing ideologies are wrong, they are unsound. So they create a confirmation bias effect they've never responded to down the bench. So here's the unique harms on their side of the house. One, they create echo chambers because they create a bad confirmation bias effect. They worsens the echo chambers in left-leaning institutes because they don't respect these right-wing professors. But second, they make a veneer of objectivity because they think these universities are objective when in fact they mask it up with tokenistic actions. But three, they lower the quality of teaching. So on academia alone, they produce lower outputs of research, they teach students worse things, they get less funding, and it's all for these reasons I am very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the speaker for this very fine speech, and I'm happy to call upon opposition reply here.
There were two votes in this debate. Proposition's vote, which is unrealistic and ignorant, and our vote, which is grounded and genuinely empowering. First, on Proposition's vote, their vote rested on a false claim. It was a lie that social sciences and the humanities were predominantly left-wing. We gave you very real examples of U Chicago or Cato Institute or Roland Frye, which is their example, which are conservative economists, for instance, of genuine and prominent affiliations that espouse genuine right-wing ideals that was seriously considered. The strategic importance of this lie was that if it is true by our side that they are balanced, then institutions will naturally check each other because academia was not dominated by one specific affiliation. This policy, therefore, only degrades the credibility of conservative professors because they were underqualified on their side. But second of all, if it is true that liberal institutions do emerge, it is probably because no right-wing people apply, because there's a natural incentive, as we proved with structural reasoning down the line, to actually make it non-partisan. What this proves is that universities do actually need to lower their standards in order to recruit these professors. But second of all, they were rested on overclaimed impacts that were asserted down the bench. It all depended on an unproven premise that they were effective in achieving objectivity. Never mind that we give you 3 reasons why this is not true. First, in many cases, they are a minority. Second of all, they'll be underfunded by the university themselves. And third of all, because they had affirmative action and they were given tenure, there was no incentive for them to genuinely object in a meaningful way. What is the strategic importance of the lack of answer? If it is ineffective, then it doesn't just mean an opportunity cost, it means a decrease in the credibility of these conservative professors. So their comparative of gradually trusting these professors and accepting their viewpoints and having free and open discourse never manifests because their opinions are never actually viewed as valid. Add this to the fact that they claim liberal students have a confirmation bias, which means that anything they receive is already perceived with a veneer of, for instance, bias against them. This only worsens credibility on their side and makes it worse for these professors to genuinely participate in meaningful discourse. But their vote was also overclaimed. Their claim somehow was that if you enact this policy, you'll prevent Gen 6 from ever happening. I want you to just ask yourself intuitively, is that true? I say it is not, because what happens in academia doesn't always translate into what happens in society. But there were 2 reasons why this is not true. First of all, professors and students weren't shamed, and the reason why is because there's an incentive of universities to not shame them to recruit students from all varieties of the spectrum. Second of all, if they were shamed, then professors were shamed as well, which wasn't the credibility on their side because these were the same left-wing people who had the same incentives. So their case was internally contradictory. If it was true they unpopular, the professors were also shamed and they were underqualified to begin with. Our vote, therefore, was realistic. They were unlikely to achieve full objectivity because of the mechanisms that were unresponded to. The comparative on our side there is that institutions have clear political affiliations that they declare. There's no veneer of objectivity. This means that you critically evaluate them for bias because you know going into it that there probably will be bias unresponded on their side. This is what the argument proved to you better for politics, because partisanship in many cases in educational institutions was a means for many places of politics to get genuine justifications for their ideas. Our frame, therefore, was never responded to down the bench. That on their side, these would be underqualified professors, and the reason why is because these universities are left-wing for a reason, despite natural incentives to hire non-partisanly. On our side, therefore, they were more qualified and they were more credible. What this then meant was, even if they were in different institutions and there's less diversity within that specific institution, there'll be a high quality of papers from other institutions of other partisan affiliations that will contest them in more meaningful manners. So we got better discourse on our side. Next, on funding. Funding on our side actually increased because we didn't abandon the liberal donors and didn't make them disillusioned. On their side, they were far less likely to donate because we disillusioned with the new veneer of objectivity and a new conservative lean. Weighing, therefore, is that in this debate, on their side, objectivity is never proven to be obtained. They just assume that it happens based on a false premise of what academia actually is. That is active harm on their side when there's a veneer of objectivity that eliminates critical thinking. Second of all, it was never exclusive because we told you that other institutions could contest this in more meaningful manners. Third of all, the quality was far lower on their side, which meant generally that this is exclusive to our side because the quality of the education is lower, credibility is lower, students suffer as a result. For all those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Speaker, for that very fine speech, and I'm happy to call Gov reply to conclude this debate.
Okay, I'm just going to turn off my camera for this speech as well. At the top of my speech, I just want to identify the sense of panic in Op 3 in reply, which is evident in their case shift. They realized they couldn't win on their first argument, and as a result, they had to make an incredibly late case shift with so much new content, shifting to explain why the veneer of perfection was so bad. But even if they won on the veneer of perfection, we gave you several responses. That firstly, this doesn't truly have an impact on this debate. On weighing, what should we care more about? Having a subconscious view of perfection in academia in which the tipping point seems so murky, or our impact of thousands of questions being asked where research is being implemented, when conservatives feel a sense of community and do not have to resort to extremist echo chambers under their side of the house. And secondly, crucially, Julian notes this, there is a tension between their characterization of the degree of liberal institutions that exist in the status quo, as well as their argument on the veneer of perfection. For their second argument to work, we need to assume that there is an inequality of representation in status quo, that our policy removed this inequality. This is a substantial reason to vote for proposition already, but the rest of my speech discusses two more reasons. Firstly, in terms of the characterization battle in this debate, Julian asks very correctly, why are we even debating about quotas? What is the purpose of this debate, and what did the CAs want the spirit of this debate to be about? It was very clearly to increase representation of conservatives, which assumes that there is an underrepresentation of them in status quo. It was deeply unfortunate that opposition clung onto a very unrealistic characterization of the status quo, saying that there are plenty of right-wing institutions that already exist. But even if we deny reality, we gave you three structural reasons why that is not the case. Number one, youth tend to be left-leaning. They are more active in advocacy, that they care more about their future in relation to climate change. That number two, universities get their tuition funding from students and donations from alumni who have also taken that liberal education. It's not the corporations and the political parties. Like, Trump is not going to be sponsoring Queen's University. Thirdly, when we're talking about them to name a well-reputed example of a right-wing university, they literally could only point to Roland Freed and not an actual institution. So just gut check this with our intuition. I think that opposition's unwillingness to engage with the reality lost them this debate. That was already one substantial reason to vote for proposition as well. Number two, on the quality of academia and discourse, what they tell us is that there is a shortage of right-wing professors who are competent enough to teach. That is not true. There are plenty of right-wing professors that voluntarily leave their universities or are pressured out because of cancel culture. But furthermore, the reason why we cannot identify that many right-wing professors is because they are afraid of expressing their views in the very first place. They're afraid of cancel culture, of losing their job, for instance. But lastly, as Neil correctly identifies, if opposition wants to have liberal and right-wing institutions to be separated, liberal institutions will have innate subconscious liberal biases, and right-wing institutions will have right-wing biases. Peer review cannot always solve for this. There's always biases within these processes themselves. These are human processes with human mistakes, and therefore there are also research biases within them in the very first place. What did we tell you then? We told you that discourse is so important, and that gets far lowered under opposition side of the house when conservatives harbor deep resentment for the liberal elite who have captured the entirety of education and the institution of education under their side of the house. They force right-wing faculty and students to go underground, to go to insular clubs filled with hate and antagonism. But even in our first argument, we explained as to why this is a countervailing force that is necessary, that this is necessary against a dominant liberal narrative in the context of where this motion is set in, which is left-wing departments within universities in the humanities and the social sciences. In the same way that affirmative action is used in universities today to increase the amount of representation for notably competent Black people and Hispanic people, that is the same reason as to why many competent right-wing professors are able to come to these universities and teach as well. It is on that basis we're very proud to propose.
Thank you, speaker, for the very fine speech. Thank you, everyone, for a very enjoyable round. Again, another massive congratulations to both teams for this excellent debate and for reaching open finals. I'm wondering if there is a